Hey everyone, welcome to the channel. In this video, we're diving into how people survived during the medieval era. Drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from and what time it is. Enjoy. Think your life is tough? Try surviving a single day in medieval times. You wouldn't stand a chance. We've gotten real soft thanks to modern conveniences, and what people back then endured as part of everyday life would absolutely wreck you. Let's start with something we all take for granted. Food. You might imagine roaring feasts and giant turkey legs straight out of a movie, but for most people, meals were dull, depressing, and sometimes downright dangerous. Forget flavor. The average peasant's diet made plain toast seem gourmet. Their go-to dish? Potage. A sad, soupy concoction of whatever vegetables they could scrounge up, boiled together in one crusty pot for days. Think of it as medieval mystery stew. Only instead of being suspiciously healthy, it was suspiciously full of dirt, bugs, and maybe a hint of despair. Bread was the cornerstone of every meal, but this wasn't your soft, golden supermarket loaf. Medieval bread was dense, dark, and full of surprises, like little bits of rock. Why? Because the flour was ground between stone wheels that chipped into the mix. People didn't have strong teeth from genetics. They basically sanded them down on rock bread every day. Here's where it gets creepy. A lot of bread was made with rye tainted by ergot, a nasty fungus that could cause seizures, burning limbs, hallucinations, and even death. Some historians think ergot poisoning was behind the mass hysteria of the witch hunts. Imagine thinking your neighbor was possessed, when really, you were just high on fungal toast. As for meat, pure luxury, and when it did show up, it was usually on the edge of rotting. No refrigerators meant you either drowned it in spices, if you were rich, or just powered through the funk. The medieval version of the 5-second rule? More like 5 days. And don't even think about washing it all down with water. Most rivers and wells were basically open sewers. Instead, everyone, including little kids, drank ale. Not the strong stuff, but a low-alcohol version that was at least safe thanks to the boiling process. One study found that medieval peasants knocked back around 8 pints of ale a day. Yes, 8. Kids included. Medieval kids didn't need fake IDs to drink. They needed them to get clean water. While you're sipping your filtered latte, imagine chugging ale at age 5 because water could literally kill you. Fish was another dietary staple. But unless you lived by the sea, fresh fish was a fantasy. Inland folks got the dried, salted, and questionably aged stuff. Basically the medieval version of gas station sushi. The smell alone could drop a grown man. If your stomach's starting to churn, good. Let's talk medieval bathrooms, because things go downhill fast. The average person didn't have a toilet. They had a chamber pot, a glorified bowl under the bed. Once it was full, you had 2 choices. Dump it yourself, or wait for someone else to do it. And by dump, we mean literally tossing it out the window. People would yell, "Gardez-l'eau," from the French garde à l'eau, or watch out for the water. But this was no refreshing splash. This was human waste, raining from the skies. Some cities even made it illegal to chuck your bucket before 10 p.m, because apparently, poop had a curfew. Visit a castle and you might be treated to a garderobe, a fancy stone seat with a hole that dropped waste straight down the side of the wall. At Dover Castle, one such royal toilet had a 70-foot drop. Kings and queens truly ruled from on high, right down to where their waste landed. Caught outside with no chamber pot? Too bad. Medieval towns had public dumping grounds, open sewers, and common privies built over rivers, and someone had to clean it all up. Enter the gong farmers, night workers who shoveled human filth from cesspits and hauled it outside city walls. They were paid surprisingly well, about 4 times the average labourer. But the smell was so bad they were banned from social spaces. As for toilet paper, dream on. Most people wiped with whatever they could find: leaves, moss, rags, even their own hands. The wealthy used cloth scraps like wool or hemp. The Romans had once used reusable sponges soaked in vinegar, but that genius idea got lost somewhere between the fall of Rome and the rise of chamber pots. Medieval life wasn't a fairy tale. It was a full-on survival game, and most people didn't even have the cheat codes. Forget the fairy tales. Being a noble knight or elegant maiden in a castle. That was the exception. The real medieval experience. Working yourself into the dirt for a handful of coins, if you were lucky. Most people were peasant farmers, living lives so physically brutal they made CrossFit look like nap time. The daily routine: wake up at dawn, work until the sun went down, collapse into a straw bed, and repeat until you died, usually young. Farmers ploughed fields with wooden tools dragged by oxen, scattered seeds by hand, and harvested crops using sickles so primitive they were basically sharp sticks. During harvest season, they toiled for 16-hour days under the blazing sun. Records show that medieval farm workers burned over 4,000 calories a day. Forget gym memberships, just surviving a Tuesday was a full-body workout. If you weren't stuck farming, you might pick up a trade. But these jobs weren't exactly cushy. Blacksmiths worked in smoke-choked forges, inhaling toxic fumes while dodging burns and flying sparks. Tanners turned animal hides into leather by soaking them in urine and harsh chemicals, often ending up with yellowed skin and a stench that followed them like a curse. Dreaming of career success? Start early. Apprenticeships began around age 7. Kids were sent off to live with a master craftsman, where they worked 6 or 7 days a week for up to 14 years, just to maybe earn the right to be called a journeyman. Medieval career guidance was simple. Can you lift heavy things? Great. You're a farmer. Can't? Try not to die. And then there were the jobs for the truly desperate. Link boys, children mind you, were paid to carry torches and light the way for rich people at night. Pure finders collected dog poop and sold it to tanners. Yes, picking up poop was an actual profession. Most workers earned just enough to scrape by. A laborer might make a penny or two a day, enough for a couple of loaves of bread, and not much else. Minimum wage? No such thing. The only metric was, what's the absolute least we can pay you so you don't die before finishing your shift? All that back-breaking labor on a poor diet meant your body wore down fast. Diseases were everywhere. Healthcare? A sick joke. A cold could kill you. A fever might mean bloodletting, leeches, or a nice warm poultice of dung. The medieval version of WebMD had one diagnosis for everything. You're probably going to die. They didn't know about germs or viruses. Instead, illness was blamed on bad air or an imbalance of humors. Blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Catching the flu? That just meant your bile was cranky. Got a fever? Time to bleed it out. Medieval medicine had one solution for just about everything. Too much blood. Let's drain some of that. And if that wasn't enough, leeches were always on hand to suck out the bad blood. One medical text even recommended applying 70 leeches at once for certain conditions. Oh, and by the way, if you survive this treatment, you're still probably dying from something else. The mortality rate in the Middle Ages was jaw-dropping. Around 30% of kids didn't make it past age 5, and the average life expectancy hovered between 30 and 40 years. The bubonic plague? That wiped out about half of Europe's population in the 14th century. When it came to teeth, things were just as bad. No toothbrushes, no toothpaste, just a whole lot of tooth decay. And the medieval dentist? They didn't schedule appointments. They waited for someone to scream loud enough to be heard through the entire village. As for medications, they were just as likely to kill you as cure you. Mercury was a medieval cure-all, from skin conditions to syphilis. No side effect warning labels needed. The side effect was always the same. You might die faster than if you just let the disease run its course. But the biggest health risk wasn't just bad medicine. It was bad hygiene. Their version of hand sanitizer, wiping your hands on your already filthy clothes, which is like trying to clean a muddy shoe with a dirty sock. Diseases spread like wildfire. Surviving medieval medical treatments, that just meant you had more ways to die. Life in the Middle Ages was a gauntlet of agony, but if you made it through the diseases, there was still the legal system to deal with. And it was a real nightmare. Medieval justice wasn't just blind. It was downright barbaric, random, and often cruel. The legal system wasn't exactly one-size-fits-all. Laws varied from town to town, So what was perfectly fine in one place could land you in the dungeon 5 miles away. There were no standardized legal codes, so regular folks had no idea what they were even being accused of until it was too late. And the punishment? Often way worse than the crime. Steal a loaf of bread when you're starving? You might lose a hand. In medieval England, over 200 different crimes carried the death penalty, including cutting down a tree in the king's forest or stealing something worth more than 12 pence, about the price of a good dinner today. The trial system? Utter chaos. You didn't have a fair trial? Nope. You had trial by ordeal. One common method was trial by hot iron. You'd have to walk 9 feet while carrying a red-hot iron bar. If your burns healed cleanly, you were innocent. If they got infected, and they definitely would, well, congratulations, you're guilty. Another favorite was trial by water. You'd be tied up and thrown into a river or lake. If you sank, you were innocent. If you floated, you were guilty and then executed. Either way, it wasn't looking good for you. If you were accused of a crime in medieval times, you were in for a raw deal. The logic behind trial by water was that water was pure. So if you floated, you were guilty. If you sank, well, that meant you were innocent, but you were probably already dead. Either way, it was a no-win situation. For those unlucky enough to be found guilty, execution wasn't just a punishment, it was a public spectacle. Hanging was considered one of the more merciful methods. But if you were really in trouble, you might face drawing and quartering. That's where you'd be dragged through the streets by horses, hanged almost to death, disemboweled while alive, beheaded, and then chopped into 4 pieces. This was reserved for major crimes like treason. Public executions were basically medieval entertainment, drawing huge crowds who treated it like a festival, snacking on food, drinking, and watching the brutality unfold. But don't think nobles were subject to the same fate. If a noble got in trouble, they could demand trial by combat. Yep, hire a professional fighter to represent them. Or they could pay blood money to the victim's family to escape punishment altogether. Meanwhile, commoners had no such options. If you were accused of a crime, you were pretty much doomed, with little chance for a fair defense. Medieval jails? They were less holding cells and more dungeons of despair. These overcrowded pits were dark, damp, and often equipped with nothing but chains to keep you in place. No meals provided. Prisoners had to rely on family to bring food, or they simply starved. Torture was the legal process. Devices like the rack, which stretched limbs until joints dislocated, or the Iron Maiden, a coffin-like cage lined with spikes, were used to extract confessions. Most people confessed to anything just to end the agony. Of course, that confession didn't save them. The motto of medieval justice might as well have been, confess or suffer, then suffer anyway. And if you thought that was bad, public humiliation was a popular punishment for minor offenses. Imagine being locked in the stocks, your head and hands trapped in wooden boards, while townspeople hurled rotten food and insults at you. Or how about the ducking stool? If you were a woman accused of gossiping or arguing with your husband, you'd be strapped to a chair and dunked in water. Repeatedly. Medieval law enforcement? A joke. Towns hired night watchmen, usually elderly men past their prime. Their main job? Shouting "Stop thief," and hoping the crowd would catch the criminal. No rights read to you, no proper investigation, just, "You're guilty, now prove you're not." The idea of innocent until proven guilty didn't exist. Once accused, you were presumed guilty, and it was on you to survive trial by ordeal, or endure some horrific punishment just to clear your name. If you didn't die in the courts, you might still face death on the battlefield. And let's talk about medieval warfare. Forget the glorified battles with shining knights you see in movies. Real medieval combat was chaotic, brutal, and guaranteed to get most people killed. Wars were constant. During the 100 Years' War between England and France, fighting raged on for 116 years. The average medieval person likely lived through multiple wars in their lifetime. Now, about that armor. Full plate armor, worn by the wealthiest knights, cost the equivalent of a modern sports car. A set of that armor could represent 2 to 3 years' worth of a skilled craftsman's wages. Most soldiers wore gambesons, padded cloth with maybe a few metal plates sewn in. Knights in shining armor were more like today's guys with flashy sports cars, rare, showing off, and maybe compensating for something. Weapons? Swords were expensive and mostly reserved for knights and the nobility. So, unless you had a hefty paycheck, your weapon of choice was probably a pitchfork or a club. Practical, but not exactly glamorous. When it came to weapons, common soldiers didn't have swords. They had spears, axes, and whatever farming tools they could repurpose for battle. But the true terror of medieval warfare was the longbow. These bows could pierce through most armor at close range, and English longbowmen trained from childhood, developing deformed skeletons from the strain of pulling back 200-pound bows thousands of times. Medieval battles were gruesome, and the death toll was staggering. At the Battle of Towton in 1461, about 28,000 men perished in a single day. That's 1% of England's entire male population. And many of those who died didn't even make it to the front lines. A brutal snowstorm claimed lives before any fighting even began. For those who made it through the battles, the real killer was often infection. A simple battle wound could quickly turn deadly when there were no antibiotics. But for peasants, the worst part of war wasn't even the fighting. It was what happened between battles. Medieval armies lived off the land, meaning they plundered local villages for food, supplies, and livestock. They didn't just take, often they destroyed. They burned crops, killed animals, and wrecked homes, leaving civilians to starve. Support our troops in the medieval world was less about patriotism and more about pleading. Please don't burn down our homes or take all our food. Sieges were the stuff of nightmares. Imagine being trapped inside a castle or walled town for months, maybe years, with no way out and little food. The inhabitants of Paris, during the siege of 885-886, resorted to eating rats, cats, and eventually each other. Sieges could last decades. The longest one, the siege of Candia in the 1600s, lasted an unfathomable 21 years. While soldiers were busy battling, disease claimed more lives than the actual fighting. Armies lived in squalor, packed together with bad sanitation, limited food, and contaminated water. During the Crusades, European armies often lost half of their men to disease before they even reached their destination. As for medieval medics, their best advice was to rub some dirt on minor wounds, and for anything else, well, it was hope for the best. If you were a civilian caught in a war zone, your choices were grim. Fleeing meant abandoning everything and risking starvation on the road. Staying meant facing violence from passing armies. Women and children weren't spared either. Entire villages were slaughtered, regardless of age or gender. If you somehow survived the battles, roving armies, and famines caused by war, there was still the everyday misery of medieval life to endure. First off, the smell. Medieval towns were foul, human waste, rotting food, unwashed bodies, slaughterhouse remains, tanning chemicals, and smoke from endless fires filled the air. Without proper waste management, garbage was tossed into streets or rivers. Butchers dumped animal entrails outside their shops. The stench was so unbearable that people carried small pouches of herbs called pomanders, their medieval version of air fresheners, though the smell was only slightly less offensive than what it was trying to mask. As for personal hygiene, forget it. Most people bathed just a couple of times a year, usually in spring and late summer, because they believed bathing opened their pores to disease. During winter, it wasn't uncommon for people to go 4 to 5 months without washing. Lice were rampant, and special combs for getting rid of them were common grooming tools. If medieval dating profiles existed, moderate lice infestation might have been listed as a selling point. Clothing: uncomfortable, rarely washed, and worn until it literally fell apart. Undergarments were made of rough linen that irritated the skin, while outer garments were heavy wool that itched like crazy. The medieval version of fashion was mostly about enduring discomfort until your clothes disintegrated. In medieval times, both the rich and poor typically owned only 2 or 3 sets of clothes, barely enough to get by. Shoes were made from thin leather with flat soles, offering no protection against the harsh elements. You'd be lucky to avoid blisters after a day of walking. As for language, the barrier would be nearly insurmountable. Middle English from the 1400s sounds almost like a foreign language to us today. Simple phrases like, "Why it is thin nama?" or "What is your name?" would be completely incomprehensible. You'd struggle to understand others, and they'd think you were speaking gibberish. Privacy didn't exist. Most medieval households consisted of a single room where people ate, worked, and slept, often all at once. Beds were shared, sometimes with strangers, especially at inns where travelers needed a place to rest. Even wealthy homes weren't much different, with servants present during every moment of your day, including those you might consider private. Entertainment was limited and often violent. Public executions were common events, drawing large crowds who treated the spectacle like a festival. There were also brutal events like animal bathing, where dogs would attack chained bears or bulls, all for the crowd's amusement. If you were lucky, less violent entertainment came in the form of traveling performers or bards telling stories. But those were rare treats. Social structure was rigid and unforgiving. The feudal system locked people into their social positions, with mobility almost non-existent. Around 90% of the population were peasants, owning nothing and working the land for nobles. Changing occupations or moving up in the world was a dream that never materialized. By now you'd probably be yearning to return to the comforts of modern life: antibiotics, indoor plumbing, human rights, and yes, deodorant. The past may seem romanticized in books and movies, but the brutal reality of medieval life was a daily struggle, one that most of us would find impossible to endure, even for a day.